Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel for what should be the concluding part of my Guadalcanal scenario from Fire in the Sky. So we left at the conclusion of the Japanese half of player turn 5, which is the last turn of this scenario. So the situation at that point where the Japanese concluded their operations, they are still battering, unfortunately for them, against the defences of Port Moresby, where the weakened Australian brigade with their sort of ragtag group of aircraft are somehow holding out against the very, very powerful pressure the Japanese have been bringing these last two turns. Now, the fact that Port Moresby hasn't fallen is a bit of a catastrophe for the Japanese because they are slightly ahead of the Allies in terms of victory points for ships sunk. And if they had managed to capture Port Moresby and then hold it till the end of the scenario, that would have clinched a win for them. I realised last night as I was going through my papers that the way I'd printed the victory conditions, they'd run over into another page. So I was only looking at the victory conditions for ships sunk. I'd forgotten that there are end of game victory point awards. And having said in the previous video that the Allies don't have the option of just sitting back, cooling their heels, and enjoying the fact that they've won the battle of attrition, as it happens, they can, because the Japanese have finished all their offensive operations for the game and they've not taken any of their major objectives. Their great mistake, unfortunately, and this was partly dictated by resources, was massing all that naval power up here in Truck Lagoon, but not committing it to the fight for Port Moresby. Now, the logic behind that was understandable. Port Moresby was tottering and ready to fall, and the Allies had no naval units within supporting range. So the Japanese plan made sense. Use the forces you've got there with heavy aerial backing to just complete the conquest of the base. And then next turn, when the Allies try to take it back, there's powerful Japanese naval units ready to launch a counter-strike to hang on to their new possession. And they'd even hoarded enough oil points to make this a bit of a reality. Unfortunately for them, as we know, the bit of the plan that did not work out was that Port Moresby did not fall. And in keeping with the strategy they decided on right at the start of the scenario, they never even bothered trying to take Guadalcanal. Taking a leaf out of Lincoln's book, one war at a time, or one objective at a time in this case. So theoretically, the Allies could actually just pass and do nothing, and they will win the scenario on points. But while I was thinking about this, I thought, well, that's a very gamey way of viewing these things. So I've decided to play it as if the Allies are desperate to relieve Port Moresby. Nobody in the historical situation, of course, would have been thinking in terms of victory points, so I don't see why they should. So with all that in mind, and given that the Allied position, if you ignore the victory point element, does look pretty desperate over there, we're going to dive in and they're going to make a fight of it to try and push the Japanese back. So, as with the previous game turn in this scenario, there's no economic calculation to be made. The available US transport points are given as 16 for this turn. Everything is preset, as are their reinforcements. They only get a trickle this turn. So they get the 2nd Marine Division, which is quite a useful asset. And they also get some more destroyers and light cruisers, which, well, you know, the extra ships are always welcome. But something a bit more powerful might have been good too. So what are they going to do with all this firepower? It's the Allied first deployment phase. That is a very good question, really. They do need, thinking long term, to keep these small air garrisons here to keep the Japanese honest. They do have a fairly powerful load of air power in Guadalcanal now, as well as the 1st Marine Division. But I don't know if they're ready to strip that base. in order to push an offensive against the Japanese. The Allies have pretty much been on the defensive this entire game. So maybe if you want to make sure of the Japanese that are trying to get Port Moresby, maybe the thing to do is commit the 2nd Marine Division to assist the Australians. Now that's going to be an expensive undertaking because we will have to get them a reasonable distance. So from Pearl Harbor, and remembering the Gilbert's exercise and aerial boundary for the Japanese, so Pearl Harbor to Ellis, and then let's say Ellis to Noumea. So that's 8 transport points used up already. So the US has 8 left. But we also need to bring some ships forward. This is where it could get expensive. Let's see what we've got available. We will want Wasp and Hornet to commit, naturally. We'll definitely want the Atlantas, the AA cruisers, to go with them. And mindful that the Japanese have a lot of submarines in the area, will want to send those 2 destroyer flotillas too. And we would like to send them... We really want to send them within supporting distance, so I think the carrier force... Let's see, move them there. And then move them to Fiji. Unfortunately, 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, I have to be a bit careful with that because that might spend all my transport points. Arg, okay. The Allies have a problem. They can't really afford to send everything. Much as they would like to, they can't afford to. So the question then becomes, do we take an immense risk and send the 2nd Marine Division in with minimal naval cover, or do we build up our forces with the intention of launching an invasion on a hypothetical turn 6, which of course wouldn't happen? That's a bit disappointing because I did want to give the Allies a counterstroke, but I don't want to be completely reckless about it because we all know what happened when the Japanese tried sending poorly protected troop convoys in during the Guadalcanal scenario, and I wouldn't really wish that on the Allies, so I have to think about this. Simply repositioning the carrier task force down to Fiji would take another 8 transport points, and I don't think that's going to be very useful. But if I don't bring them forward from Pearl Harbor, then there is no way that they're going to be able to reach the theatre of operations. And this is where the Japanese strategy was very clever, forcing us to fight at the very limit of our logistical capabilities, where even the impressive supply capacity of the United States is diluted. Yes, that is a tricky one. However, there is an alternative. Oh, actually, no, there isn't really. I was briefly considering shuttling the 2nd Marines to Guadalcanal, thus freeing up the 1st Marines to head over to Port Moresby. There's two problems with that. The first is that it would cost just as much to shuffle these divisions around. The second is that the very formidable air umbrella exercised by Rabaul would very quickly put paid to that notion, which is why, in preparation for the invasion, I was hoping, well, the reinforcement I was hoping to carry out, the 2nd Marines were moved to Noumea, because what you can then do is approach Port Moresby from the south, and by the time you're exposed to the Japanese aerial umbrella, you're already hopefully landing if there's no naval opposition. So, okay, that slightly put the kibosh on that. What to do? I think, were I the Allied player, and also mindful of the fact that the immense naval reserves the Japanese built up at Truk are still there, I would play a long game. So reluctantly, I would go through the motions, spend my last 8 transport points getting some heavy ships down there as well. So the battleships, 2 light cruisers, and some more destroyers. So that's actually 5 transport points. Do you know what? We wouldn't actually have enough transport points to move them this turn. That's very telling. It would have had to have been a more gradual transfer than that. So 2.5, let's say, for the battleships. They would take up a big logistical part of the facilities Fiji has to offer. And so moving them, just the battleships from Pearl Harbor all the way down to Fiji would come to 6 transport points, leaving only 2. And what then could I do? When it came to the operational phase, I would only have 2 transport points, which is certainly insufficient to move the Marines in an invasion. Of course, US ships can put to sea for free in a supporting role, but without an invasion, there's not much point to that. And I certainly do not want to send them in without a task force over them. So in a sense, the Japanese strategy for locking the Allies down on this turn has been a good one. There's not enough to do what we want. I could just about get away with it if I could have sent the Marines in unescorted. That's not happening. Not that air power can intervene directly, but the next turn they would make a terrible mess, I think. They wouldn't stop the US landing, but what is a bigger worry is the possibility of a Japanese reaction, because they have 6 oil points left, meaning that they could send a sizable chunk of these units down from Truk to interfere with my landings. And although I can match them with ships in theatre, I don't know if I would have enough if I left aside enough transport points to move the Marines to put together a credible task force. So I'm afraid the upshot of all this dithering is that really on this turn, a massive reinforcement and counter-strike at Port Moresby is not actually feasible, I regret to say. I mean, it came unstuck for me the previous turn when I tried to land a smaller force of New Zealanders, so that was a bit of a sobering one. So, yes, I think any offensive move I made with the Allies would be extremely costly and would actually jeopardize my ability to retake, or actually I shouldn't say retake, because Port Moresby hasn't actually fallen. to reinforce Port Moresby until further on down the line. What's actually better would be to build up the forces here. If the Japanese, as they inevitably would, had there been another turn, made another push, we could have then sortied to intervene and maybe fought them off that way. But the sad conclusion I've come to is an invasion is far too risky. But what I will do with the last two US transport points is get some more ships in theatre. Because although the other bases round here can't support very much, we can at least... Let's see now. I can at least move some light cruisers down to the Ellis Islands to form part of a backstop. And that would leave the US with one transport point left over. But yes, for the operational phase, there will be no US or Allied attacks. We'll have to sit tight for now and hope, excuse me, hope against hope that Port Moresby could hang on. Excuse me. The only other thing I could have done during the reinforcement phase is bring on reserves, replacements. You can get replacement counters for free in this game. There's no logistical charge. But the problem is you still have to pay the transport costs for getting them from your home base all the way down here, and then fighting them through the opposition in the midst of a land battle to get them where they need to go. So even looking at that, the commitment of resources would be horrendous. And there's no real guarantee, even if they did manage to land, all they would achieve would be to flip that Australian brigade back to its full strength side. So reluctantly, I'm going to say that we're simply not ready to mount an operation like that this turn. I could throw in a nuisance raid with the naval units, but again, I don't really see what that would achieve, because we don't get points for eliminating Japanese air. The naval units on their own would not be able to harm the Japanese ground units. It has to be part of a combined offensive with ground units of my own. So yes, I think reluctantly, I've used the word reluctantly a lot in this video, I will not authorize any offensive action this turn, but we will build up our strength. Had there been another turn, this scenario, we'll see what would have happened. But so no US or Allied operations, no return to base phase because nobody's deployed, and I won't do a second deployment because it's the last turn of the game. There's not anything to be achieved by that. So now we go to the victory points. So in terms of vessels sunk, the Japanese did extremely well. Losses in surface combat, heavy cruisers and destroyers and the like, were relatively balanced, but the Japanese are ahead by 4 points because they sank an aircraft carrier unit, and because they were slightly ahead on points with surface ships sunk, the score currently stands at 4, which on its own would be a clear Japanese victory. However, as I mentioned earlier, I had forgotten to double check what was on the other side of the page, which is the victory conditions for holding real estate. So the Allies, if they control Rabaul at the end of the scenario, which we most definitely do not, would have got 12 VP. For controlling Port Moresby, which we technically do by our fingernails, that's 8 VP. So subtracting that from the Japanese total, it's now -4, which is making it an Allied decisive victory. To make things even more miserable for the Japanese, we get another 6 for holding Guadalcanal, which means the score now runs into -10. In terms of territorial gain, The Japanese would have got 6 victory points each for Guadalcanal and Port Moresby. I mean, that's 6 points, yeah. So it would have been 12 if they'd held both of them. They would have had 1 VP for any other Allied base, but they didn't really bother with those. So unfortunately, despite the heavy losses in ships, and the fact that they generally got the worst of the fighting throughout the game, the Allies have just managed to hang on, and it means that strategically it is an Allied decisive victory, because this is the tipping point where Japanese resources are beginning to enter their downward spiral in terms of the wider war, whereas US strength particularly is on the point of mushrooming as 1942 ends and 1943 begins. So although it doesn't feel like a victory, because we were on the defensive and there were Japanese troops still hammering at the gates of Port Moresby, the critical thing is that the base did not fall. So a rather handy victory for the Allies, even though they're a bit battered and bruised for it, and a very enjoyable game. I quite like that short scenario. It is a bit luck dependent. I find if you play short scenarios in this game, a lot can hinge on the outcomes of the battles. But it does work itself out in the game, and I think that was a very well thought out scenario. I'll have to play it again a few times to get a sense of the balance, but if you're short on time and you don't have time to play the full game, I would definitely recommend it. So yes, that was great. And it only remains for me to say a big thank you to all of you who've watched this video, and indeed this series of videos on Fire in the Sky. I hope you've had as much fun watching them as I had making them, and that you found them interesting. If you've never heard of this great game before, try and find yourself a copy, or find a friend who's got a copy. Definitely give it a play. You won't regret it. It's one of the best broad brush representations of the Pacific War that I've ever encountered. And the full game, if you have time to play the campaign, the full campaigns, they are very rewarding. But thanks to all of you. As always, I hugely appreciate your company. To my long-suffering veterans, a very, very big hello. I hope you're all doing well. And thank you so much for joining me. To anyone who's new, if this is the first of my videos you've ever seen, a very warm welcome to you. If you like Fire in the Sky, or if you're new to it and want to learn more, I've done a number of other videos about this wonderful game. Do check those out. If it's wargaming in general that's brought you here, then you're more than welcome to. Do have a wander around, look at some of my other videos. I hope you find something else that you like as well as this. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, thanks again. Really appreciate you tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care. Bye.